Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program for the second time, to the conversation series, Leonard Silk. And Leonard Silk, of course, is the economic commentator for the New York Times. And Mr. Silk, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Thank you, Harold.
You've written, if I may say at the very outset, a very illuminating and important book, Economics in the Real World. And I congratulate you very much on the book. And I wonder if maybe you could share a little bit of the broad outline of the book, what you had in mind in putting it together. It is how politics affect the economic decisions, but it's an interesting theme and it's an important theme, the play between economic theory and political reality.
Yes, well, I think you stated in a nutshell what my intention in the book was. It is, on one level, a kind of personal or informal history of the way major economic decisions were made in this country from the Johnson administration, particularly the start of the Vietnam War, through the Reagan administration. On another level, I guess it's an effort to point a finger of blame at the economics profession and to say that your abstract models don't reveal enough about the way economic policy is actually made, and more attention should be paid to that. One of the hard things in dealing with what the real world is to say how much of it happens without, what shall I say, individual human intervention, in the sense, of course, it's all human.
Yes, right.
But in the sense of the president deciding whether we're going to have inflation or recession. I mean, the world is not so easily controlled from the Oval Office or even from the Federal Reserve. There is a society out there, there is a market economy, and things happen. So the balance between what happens as a result of conscious and deliberate national policy making and what happens as a result of that whole complex set of human decisions in marketplaces is one of the deeper mysteries of life.
Yeah, it might be a broader question of the degree to which theoretical assumptions and so forth could be codified into some sort of a science that will be able to give us a scientific handle or an ability to understand what's actually going on in the real world.
Well,
it's a broader
of course,
question in other disciplines as well, I presume.
That's right, but it's a particularly hard question in the social sciences. I think that economists, even more than other social scientists, have modeled their subject after the natural sciences. They like to think in terms of formulas and laws and principles as though the economic world were the physical world or the cosmos. I think that's extremely difficult to do and probably impossible to do, and I'm not even sure that it is wise to do it. I don't object to anybody's trying, but the results after you've got a principle or a law are much more uncertain, much more probabilistic than what at least we think of as natural laws.
Yeah, it probably goes back in a certain sense even to certain ideas of psychology, where we begin to get some ideas at a certain basic theoretical level of human nature and these kinds of questions and so forth that are built into these theories. So it really goes back into that. We have a basic trending in the American experience, laissez-faire. We have Adam Smith. We have some traditional policy views of the human society, human condition, and so forth that have served us. And then there's been these overlays of change and so forth, which have been responding to practical necessities throughout the period of time.
Right. Well, I think that's one reason why the general public is so wary of economists. It's not that they wouldn't be willing to believe anything of a general or abstract sort, but they hear such contradictory things.
Yes, absolutely.
The difference between John Kenneth Galbraith and Milton Friedman, or at a lesser level of extremes, Lester Thoreau and Robert Solow is very great. And people prescribe different things, they assert different things, and people say, well, how can both of these guys be right?
Right, with such surety that they're writing and
that's right,
and so forth, right? And it's also not only the people, but then the political decision makers have to try and understand how they can get good advice from people who supposedly can well understand the process that they have a day-to-day responsibility for.
That's right. And another problem, of course, is that economists may not be trying to achieve the same thing as either presidents or other politicians or ordinary citizens. I can't speak for all economists to say what they most want to achieve, but it's very likely to be something national, price stability, some positive rate of economic growth, and so on. Well, now that sounds as though it's something that all citizens would want. Well, not as much as they might want something else.
Yeah, that's right. Trade-offs are necessary.
Well, what they might want is, I shouldn't be out of a job. So
right.
price stability requires that I be out of a job. Think of something else.
Yeah, right, yes, right, yeah.
Or what I want is to pay less taxes. And if you want to balance the budget, go balance it somewhere else. I mean, I'm for that in general, but not out of my hide.
Yeah, well, we have it's the general proposition, maybe just at a very basic level, the general proposition or the general view of a liberally inclined, which might be more inclined with questions of equity and distribution of income to some of the lesser advantages, to those who are on the more conservative side that are concerned with growth, low interest rates, and a good climate for business. So are those general propositions one that seem to make sense, or is there a blending between them? I just wonder, from your unique perception of viewing the whole of the theory and the economic practice, if these are generally valid approaches or understandings, as we generally understand the liberal and the conservative side of understanding national economic development.
Well, both the liberal and the conservative perspective have their own validity on the basis of either the philosophy of the people voicing one view or another, or in terms of their interests. Let me leave aside the question of philosophy, although it's not unimportant and people's values do matter, and just concern ourselves with the question of interest. Some people, conservatives in particular, tend to take a very dim view of inflation, where liberals tend to put more stress on the need to reduce unemployment. Now, why is that? Is that just because of philosophy or whatever? No, I think that interest plays a part. I think that well-to-do people who have a lot of existing assets are very nervous that in inflation the value of many of their holdings will deteriorate, that their money will be worthless. If they have insurance policies or savings or whatever, that inflation is not good for them. If they own bonds and interest rates are pushed up because of the inflation, then the value of their bonds will fall. And now, of course, some rich people are favorably affected by inflation. But I think in general, well-to-do people with lots of assets tend to worry more about inflation than people with no assets, or very few.
Because the fact that there was a high unemployment might not impact them directly.
That's right. And if there's a lot of unemployment, so much...
Well, that's somebody over there.
Let somebody else worry about that. Either I'm not going to be out of a job because I own the company, or because my father owns it, or because I've got plenty of assets anyway, and if I have to get through a period of idleness, that's no sweat compared to other things. Whereas working people, or poor people, or both, face unemployment as the worst disaster that can happen to them.
Maybe they've lived through some of that, and it has been.
That's right.
You go right back to the Great Depression.
And it's not only bad in an economic sense of cutting off your income. They may conceive of it as just terrible, almost unbearable in a psychological sense, because nothing depreciates your value as not to have anybody think you're worth anything.
Yeah, the sociological
hiring.
Yeah, that's right.
So you tend to get cut off, especially in a country like ours, where your value is so equated with what you do. You may have a good heart, you may be kind to the children, or you may have been brave in the war, but if nobody thinks you're worth hiring, what are you worth?
Or if you don't have some source of income, you're just in a certain sense in a material world where you can't commandeer those things you need.
Right. So even though one can overstate it, that's why I think whether people are conservatives, like let's say the majority of rich people, or relatively liberal, like the majority of working people, you are affected by your interests in your political economic philosophy.
Yeah, and you think it is the more someone, I wonder if it is a sociological or psychological condition, that the more someone, even if they were perhaps in difficult situation as they, let's say, matured or grew up, the more they become comfortable, the less they seem to be concerned with the plight, or
at
least
that's right.
They have an adversarial sense toward the governmental kind of intervention that has been brought on politically in order to serve the interests of the underclasses.
Right. As I said before, there are no absolute laws in these generalizations, but I think there's a tendency that way, that when people are more comfortable in the world and have more assets and whatever they once were, they do become somewhat more conservative.
You think there could be a point where someone would become so comfortable where those material concerns, which might in a certain sense be seen in an abstract sense as being an insecurity in their own right, so they'd be so secure that they could in fact then have a broad overview and a broad sense of social responsibility that they would be able to see for those. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Maybe
well, I hope that's true for all mature people.
Yes, right,
that maturity means that you do think about others and not just about yourself. And I do think that some people, whether they're rich or poor or middle class, liberal or conservative, begin to stop seeing things only in terms of their own personal interests.
And that would apply then also, I should think, to the quality of political leadership and responsibility would be one that we would want to see in our political leadership, that they do have a broad, socially broad sense of responsibility for the overall society because they have a mandate to...
Yes, well, we certainly would want that.
Yes.
And we certainly would want the presidents who are supposed to be presidents of all the people.
Yes.
But I do think that our political system is one that sets up a tension between that concern on the part of even our top leaders for the public good and the good of their particular constituencies. It is very rare that a congressman or senator from, say, Wisconsin, a dairy-producing state, is likely to go against dairy interests, or for a tobacco senator from North Carolina to go against tobacco interests. I think that our government, at least in the House and the Senate, and to some extent, certainly in the administrations, tend to be reflections of particular interest groups. And that though the rhetoric is always in terms of the broad national interest, the actual behavior tends to be in terms of special interests that form your constituency.
I wonder if the executive level or the presidential level, if that broader, less parochial kind of outlook is one that's the mark of what, great leadership or something of that sort.
Well, I believe that it is, and I certainly believe it should be. But obviously, we all must make up our minds about whether particular presidents, whether they are named Ronald Reagan or Franklin Roosevelt or whomever, actually did behave in one way or the other.
And I wonder if it applies in foreign policy, whether or not you can transcend an overly parochial sense of national interest, and so whether that's a mark of leadership, and that has an economic connotation, particularly as we enter an increasingly internationalized economic order.
Well, I think it's very hard to define what we mean by the broad national interest or the public interest, because in one sense it is a summation of a lot of separate interests and special interests. We tend to use that word special interest as a pejorative. I mean, whether it's labor unions or corporations or whatever, even college professors or the press. And so how the broad national interest or the public interest becomes something good and wonderful when what it is a summation of a lot of special interests, I don't know. There's a certain mystery about that.
Well, that's part of the mystery of the political, economic, invisible hand, or I don't know, some sort of a mystery of how these things come together synergistically in some sense or other.
But nevertheless, I do think that there is a distinction, and that indeed there is some virtue in our concept of the public interest and some vice in our concept of what a special interest is.
Absolutely. And these political questions all do have, in a very real sense, it has a grounding in economics. So much of the political process is the allocation of, and the creation of, and the allocation of scarce resources. Economics is a very, very important and basic grounding understanding in terms of political responsibility, particularly now, so seemingly, or it is.
Yeah, well, that's what I've tried to do in this book, Economics in the Real World. That is to show the way particular politicians serve particular interests and how the general propositions of economics may or may not be appropriate to the things they are trying to do. And I think throughout, my reading is that the political process tends to serve the interests of the people in political power. Their number one interest, at least every 4 years, if you're interested in the presidency, is to be elected. And that's as real an interest as it is for a businessman to think about making a profit. Now, again, a lot of people are a little bit, what shall I say, careless about thinking that economics is all about making profits. It's also about winning elections.
Yes, all right, yeah.
And governing and achieving the power that a politician seeks. I don't mean to use those terms pejoratively, or at least not necessarily so, because you can't do anything unless you get elected.
That's right. Yeah.
Again, for a politician, that's a condition of life. Like making a profit is a condition of survival for a business organization.
Yeah.
But they're not the same things. And I think that much more attention should be paid by the economics profession and all of us to the role that these political objectives, narrowly defined or broadly defined, play in shaping economic policy.
These should be understood better by the people who are working out theoretically questions of economic policy possibilities that could be on the desk of decision makers.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's hard to change what the intellectuals call the paradigm of economics, which is about economic systems, prices, wages, interest rates, money, and so forth. To change that paradigm to include the political process.
And some of the, if I may, some of the, if the right term is unforeseen, or events that are going to transpire, let's say, in the future mode that we're not able to predict. Perhaps there were many people caught short for the increase of oil prices in the summer. They hadn't been able to see that. Or
well, they were caught
the
short.
escalation of a Vietnam situation that got out of hand in a certain sense. These are things that would have been a little bit hard to project from maybe a 5-year period before. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
There are things that can't be, the future can't be predicted with absolute certainty, so the theories have to sort of, in a sense, deal with these practical necessities to grow out of situations that hadn't been able to be factored in? Or
well, no, I think that's right. Now, of course, the traditional economist would say, well, I can't be everything. I can't tell you when there's going to be war in the Middle East or when there's going to be some other disaster which is going to have a shocking effect on the economy. So I can only tell you what I can talk about. But I guess my view is that at least at the level of policymaking, real policymaking, not just writing papers, you've got to be concerned about those political and social developments, and you have to be sensitive to them, aware that they may happen, and make policy with the possibility of such shocks in mind, and that you, as much as you might like it, cannot live in not a vacuum, but in a hermetically sealed economic system.
As comfortable as that may seem.
Right.
Intellectually.
It would be nice to do it, and you can do it for the sake of journal articles or books, but you cannot do it if you're a real economic advisor. You've got to take account of all the things that are important to what policy is going to be and is going to be influenced by.
Yeah, we were talking here in terms of the means by which policy decisions could, the information that could be basis to policy decisions. In the final analysis, the buck does stop, as Mr. Truman said, at a point where someone has to make a specific, policy decision.
That's right.
You
must make a judgment.
Often. And it might be that we could have scenarios of possibilities that we'd be able to act in terms of. I suppose that's being done in various policy positions, but something like, let's say, for instance, in your book, if I may, the Vietnam experience. It had a profound effect upon our national economy, and it grew out of a foreign policy involvement that might have been hard to foresee, or you sort of, in a sense, your book historically picks up in the during the Vietnam experience.
Well, I think that is indeed a very good example of it. President Johnson was urged by his advisors to seek a tax increase when they realized that Vietnam was going to cost a lot of money, and we were already at full employment. They warned him that the dangers of inflation were real. The president, for his own reasons, decided not to go with the advice of his economists. Now, of course, you can say, but look what harm came from that. Well, but a president was facing other complications. He was afraid that the war was unpopular, that Congress would not want to pay for the war. He was afraid that he would lose his social programs, the war on poverty.
He was very committed.
To which he was committed. He didn't know what the war would be a year from now. I suppose that he must have had hopes that he would be able to win, or at least bring the thing under control at a lower level.
Oh, surely. There must have been that perception at the outset.
That's
Surely.
right.
Yeah.
Now, in one sense, it's easy to say the economist should have prevailed and he was wrong. But politically, presidents live from day to day. And if he had sought higher taxes, and if Congress had rejected him and had used it as an occasion either to tell him to stop the war or to stop the Great Society program, then he would have failed in his political objective. Now, this is not to say, which I never do want to say, that therefore everything is equal and it's all a matter of choices. I think that there were wise choices and there are foolish choices. I happen to believe that Lyndon Johnson's choices were foolish choices, that he made the wrong decisions, and that the democratic process, if he had allowed it to, would have served him better than his own rather devious set of choices to achieve objectives which turned out not to be compatible.
In a certain sense, he was representing the agony the nation was going through in that situation.
That's right, and it was a very deep agony that grew out of our whole post-war experience. We had assumed the role of policemen for the world. We were involved in an effort to contain communism. We had done it with somewhat better success during the Korean War, and I think that Johnson and his key political advisors and military advisors and diplomatic advisors really conceived of Vietnam as one more perimeter war for the sake of containing communism.
We were still, the Mr. X article, George Kennan's perception and
That's
so forth,
right.
and so forth, we were in a certain sense, in retrospect certainly, we were geopolitically incorrect in our
That's right.
assumptions of that. But that was a major mistake, and we paid dearly in terms of the economy.
That's
and
right.
Still are. In a
We
certain
paid
sense.
dearly in other ways as well, although we seem to have recovered a certain amount of our strength.
Yeah.
Depends on where you are. I think that every nation tends to flatter itself somewhat at home.
Yeah.
But I don't know whether, if we see the degree to which we've been able to keep a handle on events around the world, whether we haven't paid a very serious price for our mistakes in Vietnam.
I was just thinking of the effects on the economy even.
Yes, but just in economic terms, I think it did unleash the post-war inflation, and that we have had since 1965 a long period of inflation that Mr. Reagan, at fairly high cost, did stop. Either he stopped it, the cost of a recession, of high unemployment, with the help, I was going to say, of Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
But this is true in all countries. I had a visit this morning, for example, from the chief economic advisor and spokesman for the Mapalm Party in Israel. And Israel is involved in a very heavy inflation and the problem of how to bring it under control. Well, this gentleman from the Mapalm, whose name is Dov Peleg, not to treat him as an abstract figure, said the one thing they can't do in Israel is have high unemployment, that it would wreck the society. It would mean that they couldn't bring in all the immigrants who want to come, that it would exacerbate internal strains, that was not what Israel was all about. It would destroy their image. It would be costly. An economist might say, look, I've heard all that before. But you don't know, as an economist, whether you can simply dismiss it. What you can say is, obviously, you've got a very serious problem if you're going to follow an anti-inflation program that would breed high unemployment. But I think the economist has to be wary before he says, do it. Damn it, do it. Politicians, this man is in the opposition, but at the moment, Shimon Peres has to decide whether he can risk it or not, and what the costs and dangers are if he doesn't risk it, or if he does risk it.
Right.
You can't find the answer to a question like that in an economics textbook. The answer
no matter
has
how
to
hard
be,
you look. Yeah.
That's right. You can look and look, and you can be the most brilliant economist in the world, and you can't necessarily find the answer to it out of economic theory. That is a matter for politicians and their advisors, who may include economists, to determine on what the cost will be, what the social disruption will be, the political instability, the effect on the military security of the country, things like
the
that.
psychology, the sociology.
That's right.
The broadly conceived sense
Those
of
are questions,
cohesion.
right, that go beyond what we think of as economics.
And they all factor into the political leadership role in a very real sense. And so there's many more complexities to it than just pure theoretical economics.
Exactly. And that's why our job is so hard in the area of economics, because we pretend to have a nice, neat, scientific discipline, and we don't. We have a very complex, call it art, involving a great deal of judgment.
Might call it art rather than science.
I certainly would.
You would. You'd call it art more than a science, right? I mean,
I think economic policy is an art. And if there is a science of economics, which I guess by definition there is, it hasn't very much to do with the art of political economy.
And then there's the question of these developments that would be outside of the theoretical frame that the economic projection might be, or a paradigm, or some view. There are things that happened. Well, you mentioned Vietnam was something. The oil situation with that was something that was in many people's minds unforeseen, and it was something that was a very difficult kind of situation. And you talk about the implications and the political implications of this.
But here, you may have a case where good economic advice should have been listened to earlier, and when it was listened to, it had essentially the predicted result. When the oil shock hit after the outbreak of fighting in the Middle East, the so-called Yom Kippur War, I think that the government reacted in a way that was a direct effort to somehow or other manage a crisis, to hold down oil prices lest you get a wild galloping inflation, and so on. The more or less conventional economic wisdom was not to try to have the government manage everything and control prices, but let the market operate. And conservative economists, who were not perfectly right, said, well, look, if you let oil prices go up, two things will happen. People will consume less oil, businesses will consume less oil, and the higher prices of oil will call out more supply of oil, not only from OPEC countries, but from non-OPEC countries, including our own country. We'll get more secondary, tertiary recovery of oil, and the market will come into balance again, and eventually prices will come down again.
And we might begin to develop some alternate sources, too, other than the fossil fuels, which is a long-term reality.
Yes, that's right. Well, see, I think that conventional advice was more or less right. There's still room for judgment on whether it was right immediately or right over the long run, and what to do in the meantime, whether not to do some things. But when we finally did, in the Carter administration, make the decision to move for decontrol of oil, these things did happen. And then at the beginning of the Reagan administration, there was an end to oil price controls, and that further accelerated the market adjustment. Well, what happened? Oil prices came down when you got rid of controls. They didn't go up because what was predicted by economic theory, in this case, did occur. And so there's an oil glut in the world. The power of OPEC is weakened. And we have made a much more satisfactory adjustment than I think many people who underestimate the effects of markets would have imagined.
Yeah. We've been trying to look at some of these things. President Nixon went to wage and price controls at a certain time in the 1970s and took the currency floating.
Yes.
It was a period of major change and transition. It must have been from the course that we've been following in reaction to certain of these political realities.
Yes.
And
well, again, his reasons.
There's another example that you.
Yes. No, it is a very key example in my book. Here, the reasons were, I think, less necessary. Inflation was running at something like 4%, which we would now consider very good. But that was relative to inflation that had been between 1% and 2% through much of the earlier post-war period. Unemployment had moved up to 5% or something like that, which again is well below where we are now. But he was facing an election, and he wanted to win. And he, therefore, simultaneously said, I'm going to keep prices from rising by imposing a price freeze, which was later followed by phase 2, phase 3, and so on. And at the same time, I want the economy to expand faster in order to reduce unemployment.
Stagflation looming.
That's right. So, at any rate, for reasons which I would say were political, he imposed controls and got the dollar off gold and refused to accept the discipline of the international exchanges and stimulated the economy and so on. Now, some people, even today, would say, well, Nixon wasn't so wrong about those things. In the first place, he did win a landslide. It's a shame that he blew
lost it right
by his foolishness over Watergate. But if you listen to the economists, they would tell you to wait for the long run all the time, and in the long run, as Keynes said, we're all dead, and what you've got to do is to deal with the problems of today, tomorrow, or at least the next year or two, and let philosophical economists, all of whom are on tenure at their universities, tell you about the long run, since they've got nothing to worry about.
Yes, I think if we have these things that instruments that can be done to prime the prompt, to get the economy moving, to make things a little bit less difficult, let's say, if that's right. As we approach an election year, you had a table in there that saw there seems to be a tendency on the part of political leadership to keep that very much in mind and to stimulate the economy as we come up to an election.
There's a very, very clear tendency. If I can flip to the appropriate table, you can see that during election years, the key variable, which was the rise in what economists call real disposable income, that is the amount of purchasing power you have after taxes, that it tended to rise in election years as incumbent presidents were determined that they would get reelected. And it's an extremely consistent record throughout the post-war period, even perhaps best exemplified by the Reagan victory in 1984, when the combination of stimulus from big budget deficits and the pleasures of tax cuts, which increased real disposable income, had their effect on the well-being of individuals, who then gave Reagan just about the biggest landslide in history. There was one exception, incidentally, to this pattern. Do you remember what it was?
No, I can't recall off the top of my head. But was it 68? No.
Well, it was during the Eisenhower administration.
Oh, back then.
Yes, and you could explain it partly because Eisenhower was so popular personally that he could afford to do it. He wasn't seriously threatened by Adlai Stevenson's candidacy.
56.
Or you might say his whole ideology was to be careful and cautious and not create inflation. And he was supported for that in that mood of the American people. You might also say that it wasn't a period when you had to do things to stimulate the economy. It was early in the post-war period when there was enough strength in the economy. So if you just didn't do the wrong things, the natural forces would drive you forward. I'm not sure that last statement is correct. Eisenhower did have 3 recessions during his administration. And of course, Richard Nixon was extremely bitter over the third of these because it really cost him the presidency.
You don't think it's just as we get further in time, we're getting a clearer handle on exactly what we can do to ease it as we come up to an election? But the art of knowing exactly what to do. I don't think it's really a matter of that.
No, I think we do know what we can do, and presidents may not be great economists, but they know enough to stimulate an economy in an election year if they want to. And they know enough to lean on a Federal Reserve Board and its chairman to feed enough money in the economy in an election year. I think that not only President Reagan, but even more clearly his Secretary of the Treasury, Donald Regan, were nervous that Mr. Volcker might cost them the election as he had cost Jimmy Carter the election, you might say, in 1980.
By now.
But they leaned on the Fed to some extent and did not lose the election.
Do you think there's a problem of vouchsafing the individual integrity of the Federal Reserve Board, and has it become politicized, or is there a problem?
Well, I think there's always a problem there. Everybody can judge for himself on whether particular Federal Reserve chairmen have had their integrity ripped off. I would say that on the whole they've done pretty well, with exceptions. But it's not a matter of absolute power for a Federal Reserve chairman to do exactly what he thinks. The Fed is also part of a political nexus.
Yes, right. I suppose it's true. Yeah.
It's true that he has a longer-term appointment and could hardly be removed from office for not breaking any laws, but the government has ways of putting pressure on a Federal Reserve chairman, and Congress does too. So he doesn't live in a political vacuum.
Not in a political vacuum, but there could be a certain sense of responsibility for certain kinds of indices and so forth beyond what would be a politically expedient thing to do in an election context.
Oh, I agree.
Part of somebody, and that's a kind of steersman kind of.
Well, we're a democratic society, and the head of the Federal Reserve is not a dictator over the money supply. Now, mind you, I would give Paul Volcker good marks for how he has managed, but managed in the face of very considerable pressures from both the White House and the Congress and the public generally, from the building industry, from the stock market, from all sorts of people. There are all sorts of people that come to bring pressure on our monetary authority.
Yes, right.
And a very shrewd and clever chairman of the Fed, such as Mr. Volcker, has to learn to preserve integrity, sound policy, and still accommodate these forces as best he can without giving up the game.
And there was this. If we bring it up to the more close to Mr. Reagan's election, 1980, and so forth, and we came in. There was the supply side economist. There are some people who see the closing quotes on the period that began with Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, that we were going to change the nation toward laissez-faire, toward market economy, away from, let's say, distributive context and so forth. A broad general theme, or we're seeing things almost in radical terms, some of the supply side people and so forth. I wonder if you want to comment generally on the political reality involved in terms of seeing a major change or a major turnaround or a major. Mr. Reagan's had a profound effect in his influence politically.
Yes.
As we look at the economy, as we look out through the rest of the century.
Well, I
wonder how you could judge that.
No, I think he's had a very important effect. There's always room for argument, but I would say probably the most important effect is that he has reduced the role of government and has increased reliance on the market. Now, this has not been anything like a change from 100% to zero. It's been a relative shift. The government still does interfere in lots of markets, including, for example, in the automobile market, by imposing what amounts to imposing quotas on imports of Japanese cars, or in the steel market by imposing restraints on free trade. And there are some domestic markets where the government interferes. So you can't say it's been a total turnaround. Even in terms of the government expenditure, the government's budget is now a larger proportion of GNP than it was when Reagan began. But most of that rise has occurred, well, in two areas. I was going to say in the military area, but secondly in Social Security, because of the growth of the retired population and the increases in benefits legislated by the Congress. But the fact is that when Reagan came in, about 19% of GNP was represented by government expenditures, and today it's closer to 23.5% of GNP.
The government at all levels or federal?
No, I'm talking federal government.
Right.
Right. So there has not been as dramatic an effect as some people somehow assume when you use the rhetoric.
Yes.
But I still think that what I said will stand, that there is more awareness of the role of the private sector and less reliance on government to do our problems and to solve our problems. Some people may think that's good, other people may think that's bad. But I do think that it does constitute at least a partial realization of the Reagan Revolution. In terms of the supply side, economists defined as tax cutters for the sake of stimulating the economy, I think that that is somewhat more unclear. That what we certainly do have is a failure of supply-side economics to balance the budget. That was one of the things that was supposed to happen as a result of the big tax cut of 1981 that was partly taken back in 82 and 83. But we have had the biggest run of deficits in the history of the country.
Incredible.
Just incredible. By the time the second term is over, the federal debt may have been increased as much as $2 trillion during the 8 Reagan years, and we will see whether it gets to be that big or not, but it is certainly now running at about a $200 billion rate. I guess it wouldn't be as much as $2 trillion for an 8-year period, although you can't be sure since we've got another 4 years to go.
Yes, right. At the rate they're going, and also unforeseen from a historical context. Do you think the increased investment potential of a tax cut that the supply-siders said would be the actually resulted, or was it more from consumption? I mean, did it hold true? Or
well, I wish I could answer that question. I think some of the effect of stimulus has come from the tax cuts. I'd say primarily because of its increase in the deficit, which has provided some motive power for the economy. Some of it has come from the management of monetary policy, especially after we turned down into the steep 81-82 recession. Some of it may have been to increased incentives, as supply-siders would say, that the possibility of keeping more of your earnings, especially if you were a businessman, did lead to greater investment, so on. That's very hard to prove from the overall statistics. Our rates of investment have not increased in any way that you could say was a result of incentives. They seem to fit, all the conceptions of
cycle.
That's right, and proportionate to capacity use. If they needed more plant, they spent more money for more plant to fill more orders. There wasn't some mystical elixir evident, at least that I can see. Of course, if I had a different economic religion, I might see it more easily.
Yes, I see. Yes, but I mean that would be part of the, as you put it, Reagan Revolution, and so on, that was seen by some as being, in a certain sense, closing book on that period of the period that had begun. Do you think that the Democrats did not very well at all in the last election and so forth? The liberal coalition, the general approach toward increasing government responsibility for some of redistributive developments, the war on poverty. Mr. Johnson was able to, in a politically
well, Mondale was
sense,
pretty conservative. On the whole, you might say in fiscal policy, he was more conservative than the president. I think that what hurt Mondale was his, I think, quite mistaken decision to campaign for a tax increase. Now, you can say that was brave, that was bold, that was principled. You can say whatever you want to say about it, but I think in political terms it was a blunder to ask people to vote against the president, who was going to either reduce their taxes or keep them at least as low as he had already reduced them to, on a program to raise your taxes and to raise them by surtaxes, was something that I think bewildered people. Even if they thought it was going to happen, no matter who won, they just didn't like the idea.
That's right. Yeah, right.
And told that.
Also, the question generally, the fairness issue, the concern for the people of the underclasses and so forth, and there's really considerable, recognition of that there's, considerable problems among some of the underclasses.
Yes.
Racial connotations and so forth like that. That didn't seem to carry a great deal of weight in terms of the political milieu of the nation. The nation seemed to be into thinking in a different kind of way than it did when the war on poverty had real political
people were thinking of themselves.
Yeah. Is that a natural shift sociologically? Did the political context do that, or does it go ebb and flow, the psychology of the nation? Or I just wonder. Do you understand?
Well, I think that it ebbs and flows. That in times of disaster, deep depression, you can indeed win the support of a great many Americans for programs to help the forgotten man, to use Roosevelt's term, or the forgotten woman, as we would say today, or forgotten children. In normal times of prosperity, I think we tend to get more concerned about ourselves. And, whatever you say, whether that's all as it should be or something peculiarly American, I think we do have these cycles of predominantly self-interest and predominantly social interest. One way or another, and some of it depends on the kind of political leadership you get, but one way or another, I think we've been living in a period of high concern about oneself and much reduced concern about anybody else.
Through a good deal of the end of the 70s and on into this current time,
yeah.
The pendulum may swing. I mean,
well, it may again, but the time was not 1984.
No, it certainly wasn't 1984. No.
And I think that neither Jesse Jackson nor Fritz Mondale nor any of the Democratic candidates succeeded in catching fire even with people in the lower middle class, or even some of the poor, I suppose. Many working people continued to vote for Reagan, and many working people were not only not willing to make sacrifices for the sake of people worse off than they were, but positively were angry with people worse off than they were, and just thought that you were ruining the nation and ripping them off to have welfare payments and so on.
Well, if one were to look at it, if you look at it in terms of a governmental intervention process in terms of the overall operation or evolution of an economy, the governmental or political intervention into, let's say, income distribution and the allocation of resource through such things as Social Security, unemployment, other food stamps, these kind of things, is a political intervention into what would be a free marketplace allocation of resources.
Well,
in a traditional
yes, of course.
Which would be, in a certain sense, not toward a direction of a socialistically inclined view of things and so forth. And there was a movement back toward apparently, traditional private property, market-oriented perception as a way in which the economy could serve best everyone within the society.
Right.
But I wonder if we have a problem in the sense that the property or the private property holding of technology, or those who are, let's say in real terms, capitalists owning the means of production, technological means of production, is relatively narrow, and there's very few. Most people still gain income through a labor relationship to production and so forth. Do you think there's anything to be said for expanding ownership as an instrument of income distribution? We brought it briefly off campus.
Yes, right. Yeah, well, Louis Kelso certainly argued this, and I do think there's a great deal to be said for it. But I think if I can go back one step before we return to that, then most people don't think in terms of broad ideology. They don't think in terms of distribution of income. Again, I think they think in terms of the way things affect themselves. And they don't think, well, this is good money for me because I got it by working and my productivity is rewarded and the market has rewarded me. But income I got from the government would not be real income, and I think that I would reject it. People don't think that way.
No.
If they are going to collect Social Security, they want to get their Social Security.
Yeah.
And everything you want from government is not in the name of income redistribution. It's getting something for yourself. Now, President Reagan was subjected to extreme middle-class pressures. People who wanted to stay as well off as they were or expected to be by not having him interfere with the Social Security system. And that was one of the most delicate issues for him in the campaign.
Surely, but weren't there also a lot of people in the middle class who didn't want to see tax increases that was going to distribute income that they thought they had earned to have to be paid back to distribute to someone else?
Someone else, but not away from themselves.
Right.
I think there's a great deal of support for government programs if they are programs which are conceived of as in the interests of the very broad middle class. And Social Security is a prime example of that.
Yes, Social Security certainly is, and it's part of a historical heritage that we have in a certain sense that leads you at the end of the book to, in certain very wise perceptions, if I may say so, say that we are a mixed economy.
That's
and
right.
will be against these extremes of right or to these things. We're mixed, and we almost
We
certainly
are.
will be as we move ahead, despite the
I agree.
and so forth.
And people are sometimes even mixed in their own heads about why a government program is justified, which they like, and one which is not justified, which they don't like. I think that one of the strongest reasons they like Social Security is that they think they paid for it. And they think it's theirs. It's like an insurance policy. This is mine. This is not a government program. However, they would not be particularly nice-Nelly about it. If it's something like Medicare, or if their mother is sick and she's on Medicaid, they'll think, well, Medicaid is all right. It's for my poor sick mother.
Yeah.
Why are you going to take her Medicaid away?
Yeah.
So again, I can only say that I think people think about their self-interests, which isn't a crime. I mean, I think about mine, and I'm sure you at least occasionally think about yours.
Yeah, that's right. People do. Yeah, right.
So I'm only talking about reality.
Yeah, we're talking about reality of the individual citizen, but then there is also the question of reality as is perceived by the political leadership that have a responsibility, presumably, for a broader social concern in the sense of common weal.
Yes.
So, I suppose in that sense I was trying to think of.
Oh, right. Well, those of us who like to be good, with a capital G, know that we must think of others. And the teachings of all religions is to make you think about somebody beside yourself. That's what the Roman Catholic bishops are trying to do now.
And some of the issues
think about the poor, think about people who are worse off than you. This is an injunction, not from, again, an economics textbook, but from the deepest preaching of religion.
Yeah, and as we
Old Testament as well as New Testament.
Yes, sir. And as we think of an economic system as being one beyond just the figures of economics, but it does have to do with sociological, psychological realities, all of which figures into a healthy society, which redounds into the interest of the economy in the long term. It has economic implications.
That's right.
These kind of things.
It certainly does.
Are you generally optimistic as you perceive the American economy as we begin to look ahead, or the American economy within also? And a point you made was that we live in an international world order. And do we think sufficiently responsibly on the internationalization of the economic process?
Yes. Well, no, I'm generally optimistic. I could qualify that for various troubles I can see ahead. But, I also quote in the book from Adam Smith as saying there's a lot of ruin in a nation.
Yes, right.
And I do think that we've got a very strong structure to our economic system. There are perilous elements in it if we didn't do the right things, including the banking system, including the huge amount of foreign debt, and so on. But basically, I think we have a good, strong, and essentially healthy structure, and that through the political process, we will avoid either deep depression or rapid inflation. I think that we are learning to live in the international world. So I remain basically optimistic for the years ahead, but I don't think they will be trouble-free. I'm sure the business cycle will continue to cycle. I'm sure we'll have domestic problems and international problems of various sorts, and at least for a while I can continue to earn a living.
You'll be able to earn a living, and let's hope a great deal of others will be able to do so as well. You had a couple of chapters I made. You visited recently the Soviet Union?
Yes, I did.
Eye-opening experience for you.
It surely was, and it did tend to confirm my belief in our system. I think theirs works very badly, not in the sense of being on the point of breaking down, but in producing shoddy goods and junky goods and disheartening people and destroying their innovation, their innovative capabilities. And in general, making for society which is more joyless than ours.
So that they've got a problem there, and yet there's going to have to be some sort of a working out again on a large international scale of the supposed challenges within some dialectic between a capitalistly oriented, private property oriented to a collectivist society. And in some sense, these are going to have to be. You also have one point that there isn't perhaps sufficient attention paid to the destructiveness of the capability of our weaponry and so forth in a broad philosophical sense. It's a major problem. We're at the point now where we can destroy the species, I believe, for the first time in the history of mankind.
That's right.
I think it might spell a new geopolitical reality or a new broadly conceived paradigm of economic reality beyond which we've been throughout the historical experiences.
Well, I think it could, and I hope it will. I think that we have to learn to live together in this world. And if we can have mutually economic interests in working together and trading together in growth and so forth, that will make its contribution to reducing the danger of war, nuclear or other. So I think that the threat to mankind of nuclear war should make us more desirous of building a healthy international economic order. And I see some signs that it is having that effect.
It is having that effect.
Well, it's hard to
sobering.
Yeah, right. Well, whether it should or whether it is are obviously different questions. I strongly feel it should. Whether it is a matter of interpretation. But I think that if you examine just even the last few years of history, with the efforts on the part of the administration to cut off trade with the Soviet Union and to lead our allies to do the same, that we have backed off from that. And also we have backed off from a kind of no negotiating posture. The president is about to enter more into negotiations, I mean through George Shultz and Andrei Gromyko in Geneva. I think that the forces of both politics and economics are tending to push toward peace because war is so horrible and impossible in the nuclear age to contemplate.
Do you think that we might be at a time of real peace based on world justice and equitable distribution, or that there would be a breakthrough to a condition other than the...
Well,
you don't feel a sense of
not
birthing to
peace.
some new
I think
millennial sense or something of that sort? To offset the fact that we can, for the first time, destroy the species after 3 million years
that
of
I'm
evolution?
not quite as willing to be sure of that as all that. To say that might be to reduce the efforts to do the things we should do to achieve peace. I think that there are still enough dangers, including those of accidental war, for us to worry about it. And I do think that there will be peripheral wars, to use the term I used much earlier, in Southeast Asia or conceivably in Western Europe or in the Middle East, that those dangers are real. We've got wars going on now, so it's hard to say with Iran, Iraq, and the Soviets in Afghanistan, and the Cambodians being invaded by the Vietnamese and so on, that there are no dangers. So I don't like to be Pollyanna about these things, but I have hope that in its own horrible, unbelievable way, the nuclear age could prove to be a blessing if we are smart and determined enough to turn it into one.
Well, if we are smart enough and capable enough to have understanding that can allow us to realize the full advantages of the political and economic realities of the time in which we find ourselves to service all of the human society to a new degree, it would depend to a considerable extent on people who can understand the dialectic or the between these two things, if I may say so. Someone who has contributed mightily to bridging the gap between economic understanding and the in-world political realities has been yourself. And I really want to thank you very, very much for all of your work over the years, and particularly and specifically for the book now, which we might want to recommend again, Economics in the Real World, How Political Decisions Affect the Economy. We've only been able to touch on some of the subjects that he goes into with great and lucid depth, and recommend it very highly. Thank you very much for viewing. Sorry, we've run right out of time for this particular segment. We'll be coming back next week. We'll see you next week once again, Mr. Silk. Thank you very much indeed for everything.
Well, thanks, Harold.
Not at all.